what social media and just the democratization of everything has given us is some insight into how rotten our institutions were in the first place.
There's a kind of wokeification of the right that is happening.
It's like professional wrestling. Nobody cares that it's fake. If I was caught doing that, I would lose my 100% of my audience.
You have to hear what they have to say.
No, but that's a self-reinforcing
sorry, Sam.
error loop.
Let me just finish the point.
The smell of bullshit is detectable far enough off that you just don't have to spend time with it.
You're not going to put new media back in the tube, right? That's toothpaste is out. It's out there. People are going to have those conversations whether you like that or not.
And we have, Islamist stealth groups in every Western society, certainly in America and the UK.
We are living in an age now of conspiracy. People believe that the people in power, the experts, the institutions are lying to them. And I want to know, does this create problems that we should be worried about? And if it does, why should people listen to the two of you? Why are you guys trustworthy?
Well, you want to start?
No, you go first.
Okay. It's something I'm quite worried about. I think we're getting profoundly misinformed by the tools we have built, and I think it's a multi-level problem. On the one hand, many of us feel that what social media and just the democratization of everything has given us is some insight into how rotten our institutions were in the first place, right? So there's much more transparency. The emperor has no clothes in many cases, but I think it's in part that's true. But I think what has also happened is that the institutions have become corrupted by the tools we have built. So, as my friend Barry Weiss pointed out when she left the New York Times, that Twitter had effectively become the editorial board of the Times when she left, and that's not simply a matter of shining sunlight onto the distortion of the priorities of the Times. The tools effectively distorted the priorities of the Times, and for some period there almost ruined it. So I just think we have to acknowledge that we have built a machine for propagating hallucinations and distortions of reality that we don't know how to use. And so, to come to your question about why either of us are better brokers of information, I think you have to look at what we're specifically doing and the incentives we have built in our various platforms to motivate us to work. And I've been very careful about this phenomenon of audience capture, which is what happens to even people with real integrity and the best intentions. They notice a signal in their audience. They notice an appetite for a certain message. And because they're incentivized to feed that signal, they do it, and they wind up becoming radicalized by their audience. And because this may be less true of you, given the kinds of topics you touch, but maybe not. I'm really not political by tendency. I just hate politics. I just view all of it as just this massive opportunity cost. And so whenever I touch politics, I'm really not aligned right or left in any kind of predictable way. And so I wind up pissing off people on both sides. I certainly piss off the far left and the far right, I would think equally at this point. And so whenever I'm touching a very topical, polarizing issue, I'm pissing off some considerable portion of the audience. And so I've just learned to simply not care what the audience wants. And so I can honestly say that I'm never even feeling the impulse to be blown around by the wind of sentiment in my audience. It's just not what's happening. I find what I think is interesting and consequential, and I talk about it. And since I deleted my Twitter account, I almost never even see what's coming back at me. So it's for better or worse, I don't see what's coming back at me. And so I'm really not. I'm just calling it as I see it, and I'm very happy to have built a system that allows me to do that.
Okay, so you don't have the deranging incentives that a lot of people have. Konstantin, talk to me about, is what we're going through problematic? And if so, in what specific way? So I think Sam laid out, yes, it's a problem, but why exactly? What does this derangement do to us as a culture so much that we should do podcasts about it?
May I also pick up on some of the things that Sam mentioned as well? One of the things I would say first and foremost is that I've never made the claim that other people should listen to me. I am not intent on making that claim in the future. The only area where I might invite people to listen to me is the invitation for critical thinking. I think that's an area where I hope that me saying that is helpful. But apart from that, people should make up their own minds. I think a lot of the critiques that Sam has been making for some time are exactly right about the nature of institutions first and then the response from the media to them. Because I don't know if this is true, but I suspect we have the least corrupt institutions we've ever had. That's very possible. I'm not saying that is true. I'm saying that's a possibility. And what has happened over time is our insight into how corrupt they are has improved our ability to understand how corrupt they are. So, of course, they are corrupt, but they may be a lot less corrupt. And we can sort of logically think about that from the perspective of, if power corrupts, when the New York Times literally had a monopoly on all information, I imagine they use that power even more than they have been in recent decades, right? So what has happened is our faith in institutions has declined because we no longer are willing to tolerate the level of corruption that we now know is there. The problem is that at the end of the day, we still have to at some point be able to agree on what reality is. And we are now in a space where I think that the fragmentation of our reality has reached levels that are actually unprecedented, to the point where if you think about words or names or anything, they no longer mean the same thing to most people, even more so than in the past. So the way I think about it now is, if you take a name, Sam Harris, Donald Trump, Konstantin Kisin, whoever, the person who's hearing that phrase has an experience of who that person is that will be quite often almost entirely different to what another person who looks just like them sitting next to them has of that same person. So what Sam Harris is to people depends on what Sam Harris content they've encountered. What constant and we can go down the path. So how do you then have a conversation about ideas, about people, about anything? I think the fragmentation of our reality is a really scary thing. And then you layer on top of that the other point that Sam made, which I think we're seeing play out. And I've always been very hesitant to believe in the idea that audience capture is ubiquitous and affecting everybody. And I have realized over time is because I'm a very highly disagreeable person. So from day one, I've been like, I really enjoy people. I don't enjoy. I am willing to be unpopular with different people because I care about the truth. And I'm not saying that I have better access to the truth than other people. I just care about pursuing it in my own way. So on trigonometry, over time, we have pissed off left and right, like Sam, during the summer of BLM, we were very clear that what was happening was a problem. January the 6th, we were also clear that was a problem, but there were a lot of people for whom it was either or. Either BLM was a problem or January the 6th was a problem. You couldn't say that both were a problem, right? And we lost, I call it pruning. We prune our audience all the time. It's like, well, if you want to be extreme, this may not be the right place for you. And I'm much more interested in, having 1 million subscribers on YouTube, which is where approximately we are now, but pursuing the truth as best Francis and I can, versus having 10 million subscribers and pandering to an audience that makes me resent myself and them. But the other thing we all know is human beings do respond to incentives. So in the world in which, it's very clear to me that the modern information ecosystem is not optimizing for truth. It's optimizing for outrage. It's optimizing for extremism. It's optimizing for engagement, which those two things produce. And I noticed this I mean, there's a kind of, I'm trying to introduce this concept into the culture, and I don't know if you'll agree with me on this, but there's a kind of wokeification of the right that is happening.
Define that?
Well, if you think about what defines wokeness in terms of tactics and behavior, it's glorification of victimhood, hypersensitivity, and attempts to restrict the speech of others where it conflicts with their pre-existing ideas. That is all happening on the right. And I really experienced this. I wrote an article on my Substack that I then made into a video called Tucker Carlson and the Woke Right, which was a response to his trip to Russia, where he magically discovered that they have shopping carts and, basically misled the American people about the idea that food is cheaper in Russia, which is complete BS. In relative terms, Russian people spend way more of their household income on food, and it's not because they eat more, it's because it's way more expensive. And every single major influencer that I've discussed this, not every single, sorry, I take that back, most people who you would see on your X feed or on your YouTube that I've spoken to about, they don't give a shit. They do not care. They just think Tucker Carlson is this big name who has a huge audience, and that's what they care about. Now, that worries me tremendously, because if we are talking about making sense of things, making sense requires the ability to say, this has gone too far. We have now reached a stage where we're not talking about the truth. We are now pandering, playing to our audience, compensating for our own psychological traumas. In Tucker's case, I think it's his support for the war in Iraq means that he's anti every American intervention anywhere now. And that means if we're not if the incentive structures are not there to optimize for truth, then we are going to get whatever it is that we're optimizing for, which seems to be outrage and the hottest take. And the mechanism for challenging that just doesn't seem to be in place at all. So I think last time I was here, we spoke about the positive impact I thought new media was making. And I think in terms of the democratization of information, I think that was necessary. But I think I was a little blind, truthfully, to the long-term impact. And you actually made the point at the time, as I recall, that I was a little blind to what the flip side of that coin was going to be. So I think we're in a very tumultuous time, and how our information system adjusts to that will, I think, determine where the world goes.
All right. One thing I find when people are debating a point is that they're not getting to the underlying assumptions that drive their worldview. And therefore, my wife and I have a rule in our marriage: never argue about the tea. The biggest argument we ever got into was over a cup of tea, which of course was not actually about the cup of tea. It was about the underlying assumptions, and the tea just became the lightning rod.
Well, she's British, so we take that shit pretty seriously.
No doubt, no doubt. So I hear you guys both saying this is a problem. I hear we're even circling around the truth, and the truth, if I were just listening to this and this was all I knew of the two of you, I'd say the truth matters, but I don't yet understand why. And I feel like the culture war is really a war where two people think they have the truth, but they have not agreed upon how you determine what is true. I'm hypersensitive, and I've mentioned this to you before. I know you and Jordan really derailed on how we define truth. So instead of necessarily right now getting into how we define what is true, I want to understand why the truth matters. And I'll say, just for simplicity, that the truth is the bedrock upon which you can build the rest of your life, and you won't have a hard time making predictions. So the stupid example, but it will orient people, is nobody walks out of their second floor window because we all agree foundationally that gravity is real and you can just sort of take it for granted. So my thing has always been just to give truth a proximity. It's that which has predictive power. So I can predict that if I step out my window, I will fall and get hurt. It's predictive. So if we can all agree on that definition, is that why you guys think truth matters? In that it just gives you a foundation and you can build upon? Or is there some other reason?
Well, I mean, the truth matters because there is a reality, and if we're not tracking it to some pragmatic approximation in our lives, we're just going to bump into hard objects. I mean, it's just on every level, from our health to our figuring out what the weather is going to be tomorrow. I mean, just like we're in relationship to a system that's much bigger than ourselves. And if we're delusional about cause and effect and any picture of how things happen, we're just going to be perpetually victimized by our ignorance, right? So I mean, so representing, having a map that fits the territory to a first approximation has been useful long before we could even form the concepts that would allow us to have a conversation about it. I mean, epistemology came online before we had the concept of epistemology, which is how we know things. So I don't think anyone has to defend the value of tracking the truth. I think it's we're always just approximating it, and we're never arriving at some final truth that no longer admits of any other argument or possible counter evidence. It's not that everything's always up for grabs equally, but it's usually a matter of a probabilistic sense of what's true, and the probabilities tend to get so high that we no longer are disposed to reconsider things, right? So if you're going to ask, well, do we know anything about the biological basis of inheritance, and does DNA have something to do with it? Well, 99.999% of biologists will say yes, DNA is the answer to that question. And it's not that we understand everything about it, but we understand enough that that's not where the new theory making is happening in biology. And the problem, and this is especially a problem in the current context of social media and alternative media, you can always find a crazy PhD or a PhD who's semi-crazy and has just a hobby horse that he can't get off of, who will attest to anything, no matter how crazy, right? So you could see there are enough people with graduate degrees on any topic that the cigarette industry could find a bunch of PhDs to swear in front of Congress that cigarette smoking is not addictive, right? So even when they knew it was. So since you can always find those people, it's not enough to have found one guy who will tell you that vaccines cause autism and will swear and swear and swear again even when he loses his medical license. And we're wise, again, given all the caveats about bad incentives and the possibility of even the most esteemed institutions becoming corrupt, we're wise to trust by default the consensus of experts most of the time. And it's not to say that there can't be a lone genius who proves the experts wrong and overturns our paradigm. That happens, but this is the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence heuristic, right? I mean, just if you're going to say that you have a new version of physics and it allows for time travel, okay, we all need to triage our attention and our time and decide whether or not this is worth a podcast or worth it's certainly worth being invited to a conference.
How do you make that
often
decision,
the answer is
by the way?
no. I mean, usually the answer is no.
Under
right?
what rubric?
Well, again, there's no algorithm for deciding what's real, because it's just that would be
Can I propose
computationally impossible. Well, I mean, it's just functionally impossible. We can't in advance know what we will later know. I mean, we just can't produce knowledge that way, right? So it's always iterative. It's always a matter of error correction.
In terms of what you approach and respond to?
Just in terms of how you model, like just how knowledge grows. It can't be a matter. If we had an algorithm for flawlessly producing each new increment of knowledge, we would essentially be able to model, the total future of our knowledge. I mean, it would just be it's that system would bite its own tail. It's not computationally, possible to do that. So we need error correction mechanisms, and so at the grossest possible level. And you mentioned someone like Tucker Carlson. I mean, the reason why I find Tucker's career at this point so grotesque is that he's managed to build an audience that simply doesn't care when he lies, right? When he's shown to be lying. I mean, there are different ways to be uncancelable. One way to be uncancelable is to actually have pandered to an audience, found an audience that wanted to be pandered to in such a way that they don't care that what you say is no longer truth tracking, no longer even attempting to be truth tracking. This is a very Trumpian phenomenon. I mean, Trump is the quintessence of this. I mean, he's found people who don't care if he contradicts himself over the span of 3 minutes, right? It's like, because he's just creating a mood of grievance and pandering to the grievances of his audience and demonizing the outgroup. And it's all theater. It's like professional wrestling. Nobody cares that it's fake. It's like the fact that it's fake is priced in, and they just want the spectacle. And so we have even so-called news gathering creatures like Tucker, who are just creating a spectacle and some kind of political theater, and it's got this very weird gloss of like super high integrity. I'm just telling you, I've been wrong before, and I'm telling you the way I see it, but it's. I mean, in the clearest instance, we know from his private texts that were leaked in the Dominion lawsuit that he hated Trump all the while, couldn't wait for him to get out of our politics, thought he was a demonic force, and yet for years had been shilling for him, for his audience, right? So you can call that audience capture, you can call that hypocrisy, and I mean, it's all those things. But the crucial thing is, if I was caught doing that, I would lose 100% of my audience, right? And anyone with a real reputation for integrity for their audience would suffer a similar consequence. But what we have are people who can be caught lying or can be demonstrated to be nuts. I mean, so in many cases, someone like Alex Jones fits that description, and yet there's still this massive audience that wants to hear the next thing they have to say. And that's, I don't know what you call it, but it's not a conversation about reality. And yet people are using it in the same vein as we use any other product of journalism, as though it's providing some kind of guidance for what's happening or what's likely to happen.
So the thing I want to hear, and I guess my base assumption in bringing the two of you on is that ideas matter. They will influence the individual life and one's ability to get to human flourishing. And every individual, when brought into a collective, means that a society either can or can't get to human flourishing. So that's my confession about what my North Star is. Yeah. And when I hear people arguing about, hey, there's this crazy Trumpian phenomenon, or there's this crazy Tucker Carlson phenomenon, is arguing at the level of the T. To me, this is a conversation about what you said previously, which is the reason that the truth should matter to you, dear listener, is that you will constantly injure yourself by, and now I'm using my own words, by not being able to predict the outcome of your actions. And so if you are intaking all of your information from somebody who is, I've heard you define a bullshitter previously, somebody who just does not care whether what they're saying has any internal consistency whatsoever, it's just about getting the right response out of their audience. And if you do that, if you take on that entertainment, because it is very entertaining if you agree with them, you will fail to achieve the things in your life you want to achieve, because you will have built upon a foundation that just is not predictive at all. And if that really is true, re-anchoring the conversation back to that seems to me, and you guys tell me if I'm being naive, but seems to me the only way out of the death loop that is us birthing an age of pure conspiracy. Did you guys watch the Joe Rogan, Terrence Howard interview?
I saw a clip of it that people were hurling at me for its.
Yes,
I hesitate to say it's entertainment value, but it was entertaining.
The US dollar's value is being rapidly eroded, and if you want to have at least some of your investable dollars and assets that can't be inflated, you should look at gold. Gold has proven to be a good long-term store of value since literally the Roman times, which is why, even though I have the vast majority of my holdings in crypto, I have a percentage of my portfolio in gold. And if you're interested in learning more about gold, I recommend you contact American Hartford Gold. If you tell them I sent you, you can get up to $15,000 $100 of free silver on your first qualifying order. Click the link in the description or call 866-934-4005 or text IMPACT to 65532. Again, that's 866-934-4005 or just text IMPACT to 65532 or click the link in the description. Please remember, there is always risk involved in investing and there is absolutely no guarantee of any kind.
It is entertaining. And so if you guys are right and there is a problematic breakdown when people have lost sight of the fact that perhaps because there's two paths. They're listening to an interview like that because the establishment has lied so many times that when somebody says, hey, listen to me, I've been shut down erroneously, you need to hear these things and they're going to help us. Maybe that really is true. Or maybe it's, we've now just given up pursuing quote unquote truth because we have no idea how to find it, nor do we know why we care about it.
Well, may I add a couple of pieces there? First, I don't know that that's true. I don't think we've lost that. I think there's a few things going on. First of all, anything that involves a camera and a microphone will naturally over-prioritize charisma. So one of the things that happens with any kind of mass communication is this is why truth matters, because actually being interested in what's true is the only way I think that we are able to overcome very faulty heuristics that human beings have evolved with. And I'm not saying they're faulty for the ancestral environment 50,000 years ago, but they are faulty in the modern world, right? And our cognitive biases will naturally lead us away, I think, from truth, because that is a much harder path. In the same way that the reason it takes discipline to go to the gym and work out and lose weight is that it's much easier when you're surrounded by abundance to just shove food in your mouth and not do anything, right? It's much more comforting. It's much easier to do. So I think that being interested in what's ultimately true is the way that we can overcome our inclination to believe things that charismatic people tell us, to believe things that match what we already believe, that is essentially, to some extent, the nature of the scientific method, right? Is testing as reality as opposed to going, well, this seems right, or I believe this, or whatever. So I think that ultimately the reason I'm really interested in it is I think that it's the only way to overcome my own predisposition to believe things about the world that make me feel good, that are not, as you say, predictive and therefore useful. And unless you operate in the world from that perspective, unless that's what you're optimizing for, your brain is going to take you off on a loop. And now we live in a world where every whim of yours is catered to. And if your whim is to be entertained, if your whim is to hear a conspiracy, and I have to say, I don't know why, and I'm actually really interested in investigating and finding out. I have found that I think in the US, those kind of ideas about how the world is and who runs it and all of that seem to have a way broader appeal than they do in the UK where I live. I don't know why that is. It could be the flip side of the beautiful American idea that, I remember America is a nation of believers, and I don't mean necessarily religiously. I just mean, the idea that you can tame a continent in a couple of centuries and create this incredible country, which is the most powerful and, in my opinion, the greatest society in the history of the world, that's an act of faith in and of itself. And maybe the trade-off is that, Americans are very good at believing lots of different things, and this is one of them. So that's maybe why really being interested in is what I'm tempted to believe an accurate reflection of reality is the antidote to going off the rails on that front. And I think that's why I am so interested in it. It's really to guard against my own cognitive biases that I think we all have.
Well, let me give you an example of just how distorted I think our current moment is, because I find it surprising. So you take the war in Gaza, right, and we're now on the tail of all of these college protests we've witnessed in our finest institutions. Apparently an endless number of people expressing sympathy for the Palestinians and even sympathy for Hamas. and which is just officially a genocidal death cult. I mean, it describes itself as a genocidal death cult, and they seem, everything to my eye morally seems upside down. I mean, they can't distinguish the difference between people who use human shields versus people who are deterred by the use of human shields. They can't distinguish people who intentionally burn families alive from people who inadvertently kill innocent people, trying to kill the people who burn families alive intentionally. So there's just so many asymmetries here. But what's amazing is you have these protests on college campuses effectively silencing even some of the most powerful people in our society. I mean, even just celebrities who you'd think would be totally unconcerned to express their opinion. They're being silenced. They understand that there's a difference between Hamas and the IDF. They won't say anything in support of Israel because it's just too toxic in Hollywood or among Fortune 500 corporations. They're so worried about being boycotted and public backlash, especially on social media, and yet on the other side, there are people signing. The celebrities are signing letters in support of the Palestinians, and they're not at all concerned to be mistaken for people who support Hamas or even outright anti-Semitic. So there's that asymmetry of public opinion, and yet there was just yesterday a Harvard-Harris poll that revealed that 75% of Americans are all in for Israel. They think Israel should just rout out Hamas tomorrow in Rafah, right? I mean, everyone's been debating whether the IDF should go into Rafah, and this is an absolutely tortured debate. 75% of Americans say go into Rafah and kill Hamas, right? That's where public sentiment actually is. And yet we have built a machine, right, where even the most powerful people in our society are terrified of the 25%. They're busily offending either by their silence or by their support for Hamas, effectively 75% of America, and they don't even know it because everything is so distorted. The whole information landscape is so distorted, based on the capture of certain elite institutions by some very confused people on the left, and what we've done on social media. I mean, everyone's just looking at X thinking, oh my God, everyone supports, everyone thinks Israel is guilty of genocide. I should keep my head down here. I know Israel is not guilty of genocide, if the word means anything, but this is just too dangerous. And yet, in terms of the actual public sentiment of the people who could buy the tickets to your next film, it's completely reversed in reality.
And I think one of the reasons that is, there are obviously lots of reasons, but one of the reasons is in the social media age, the cognitive bias of, oh my God, I am seeing horror on my screen, therefore this is wrong, right, automatically, is very hard to overcome. And it's very difficult to argue against that. When you're seeing, look, I'm a father. When you see dead babies being pulled out of rubble by their parents, like there's no human being alive, unless they're a psychopath, that doesn't go, oh my God, this is awful. And this should stop immediately, right? But does that really reflect the nature of reality? No. But we also have a significant portion of the population that cannot think past their emotions. But that notwithstanding, 75% of Americans think they should go into Rafah. I think your point is well taken. I wasn't disputing that at all. And I think your point about the fact that there are different conversations happening in different places, I think is absolutely right. My point is, I think one of the reasons for that is 75% of Americans are not sitting and looking at their phone every day for 8 hours, watching children being blown apart and whatever. But those people who are interested in what's going on and are looking into it, they are not able to think past, I have seen one image.
Yeah, dead babies. Yeah.
And dead babies are bad. I think we can all say that, right? I mean, it's uncontroversial. But being confronted with the nature of war and thinking that it's horrible, I think is a useful thing in terms of really being reluctant to get into wars unless it's absolutely necessary. On the other hand, you have to be able to see past your emotional, visceral reaction in some situations and say, why is this war happening? What is the objective of this war? Who is responsible for this baby being pulled out of rubble? Who is it? Is it the people who are going in to kill terrorists? Or is it the terrorists who are using the baby as a human shield?
How do you run that moral math? How do you get everyone to run the same moral math?
I don't think you can. I don't think look, this sounds elitist and snobby. I don't think everyone's capable of it. And we see evidence of that every day. A lot of people like to operate solely by emoting. And we now have tools that encourage them to do so.
Well, people can get better at consuming video, right? I mean, we know we're bad at this, and we should spell out why people are bad at this. So you see a video of some guy being beaten senseless by a crowd, right? And it starts in the middle of the emergency. He's getting, he's already down, and he's getting punched and kicked by 5 people. He certainly looks like the victim, right? But you have to understand that you don't know what happened just before the clip started, right? You don't know. So I've seen video like that where I assumed, okay, this is an atrocity. This guy's obviously the victim, and yet I find out that this guy just stabbed someone, and he's being subdued by a bunch of unarmed, terrified people, right? Right. So it was exactly backwards, right? And so we know that even when things seem absolutely obvious based on the clip, they could be exactly the opposite of what you think. And so it is with scenes from Gaza. I mean, this was, I remember Rogan at one point was analyzing, I forget who he was talking to, but he had some clip of, 5 guys being bombed in Gaza as though this were proof of war crimes. And these were obviously unarmed, young men. And who were just walking. They seemed to be guilty of nothing other than walking, and they got hit by looked like a drone, or it was not clear, but they were killed. And yet we have no idea what happened before that clip started, right? So we don't know whether they just planted an IED and it was absolutely obvious that they were combatants and it was totally valid within the rules of war to target them. You just don't know, right? So we have to become better consumers of our own emotional reactivity in response to admittedly disturbing imagery, whatever the actual accurate interpretation.
Do you have a method for that?
Well, it's just to continually price in my uncertainty about those kinds of variables, but the truth is, honestly, my method has been to spend much less time on social media. I deleted my Twitter account. So now when I look at X, it's just because someone has driven me there, like, you have to see this. And then occasionally I'll look at my feed. So I have a feed on X that's not following anyone, and on which I have basically clicked nothing apart from occasionally getting sent a video that has brought me there, or a post that's brought me there. And I am amazed at what a digital sewer it is in terms of what it is trying. I mean, the algorithm seems to just want me to be terrified of the world and probably racist in at least 2 directions, right? It wants to show me black people beating up white people and white people beating up black people, in classrooms all over America. Like, how much this happens, who knows? But or a security cam video of just somebody being horribly murdered for whatever reason, or just accident. I mean, it's just, and then obviously there's the occasional cute cat video, but it's like we have built there's
white cats beating up black cats and vice versa.
But I mean, we've created a psychological experiment and enrolled everybody.
Yeah.
And it's it's analogous to watching local news all the time. I mean, I learned 30 years ago that, or longer, that I didn't want to spend much time watching local news because there's always just some depressing car chase, or somebody was raped. It's like, I don't need to know this. It's not actually going to change what I do, and it's just this tawdry regurgitation of human misery. And there's always at least another, no matter how small the locality, maybe certainly in any big city, any big city is big enough to always have some horror that can be broadcast into your brain about which you're going to do absolutely nothing, and it doesn't make sense for you to even be cognizant of it, and yet it's there to depress you. And social media has become this on a global stage. And it's just, I mean, again, it's not that I want people to be oblivious to what's happening in the world. I mean, I do want to know, I want to have a map that fits the territory. I want to know what the rates of violent crime actually are, et cetera. But those data are communicated very differently, and they often don't track the imagery that we all get in our heads just by looking at a scroll, right? I mean, you see what this is what's so distorting about these videos. I mean, most people on the left, certainly anyone left of center in America, thinks very likely that we have an epidemic of lethal police violence against young black men, right? That if you know, it's totally rational if you're a black parent to have the talk with your young black son. If he goes out there, he's much more likely to get killed by the cops than his white friends, and this is just an intolerable legacy of racism in America. As far as these stats go, the best understanding of what the dynamics of actual police violence and the 1,000 people every year thereabouts who get killed by the cops, we know that's bullshit, right? It's just not what's happening. The likelihood that you're going to get killed once you come into contact with the cops, if you're black, is not higher than if you're white, right? But everyone has seen 12 videos that makes it seem like they're these lunatic cops performing lynchings, and they haven't seen the analogous and in fact more numerous cases where unarmed white people have been killed by cops, once again disgracefully, in many cases, but the actual stats are just show you how infrequent it is that an unarmed person of any color gets killed by the cops in America. It's just not happening very often. I mean, it's around, it's maybe 40 people a year, a majority of whom are not black, and of the 1,000, and among those unarmed people who get killed by cops, most of them are not peacefully. Most of them are trying to kill the cops. They're wrestling with the cops. They're trying to get the gun out of the cops' hands. It's not like the cops are routinely killing nonviolent people in America, and yet we have a kind of pornography of racial grievance that is continually advertising a different story to us. And again, so given the dynamics of social media, that is always going to prevail. I mean, that's just like because of the algorithmic incentive to spread the outrage.
Other than, Sam, the pursuit of truth, which I think the point you were just making is actually a very good example of where the genuine pursuit of truth and context. In Russia, there's a Russian saying, everything is understood in comparison, right? And what you're talking about is a very good example of where actually finding out what the data is not only is useful, but it actually can change your life, especially if you're a young black man, because you are then less likely to go into that police interaction with the expectation that you will be killed, which means you're going to act differently, which means that you're probably less likely to be killed as a result, right? Knowing that context, knowing that what the statistics are, it is going to inform you to behave in a different way. And this is what I was going to make. I'm actually really reluctant to get involved in the Gaza conversation beyond some basic obvious things, just because I don't know enough about it. But I think one of the critical things in analyzing this conversation, like many others, is the importance of history. And that's the context in which human beings operate in, the history of human beings. Thomas Sowell, who I pretty much worship at this point, he's written extensively about the idea that the best way to understand what people are likely to do in the future is to look at what they've done in the past. And you can slice that 100 different ways. If you find clay tablets from ancient Egypt, they're going to be likely basically discussing the same things that human beings discuss now. My son doesn't, a mother complaining about her son not being around and all this other human stuff. So when we are looking at the conflict in Gaza, I only bring it up because we've been talking about it. I've been trying to say to people, well, if we are going to talk about this seriously, let's look at previous situations in which conflicts of this nature have broken out, for one reason or another, and how has that happened? People give the example of Fallujah, and I think Coleman Hughes actually did a very good job with Joe talking about this on his podcast. But beyond that, whether it's the Japan at the end of World War II, whether it's what happened in Germany at the end of World War II, whether it's previous situations in which a group of people have attacked another people and then lost that fight. How does that normally go? How have we treated this in history? That gives you a context that is very useful for offsetting the visceral experience you have when you're confronted with the reality of war, which is horrific. So in that sense, as you know, my big concern about the direction of the West is that we are becoming divorced from our history on so many different ways, and we are being sold a bunch of lies about how we got here and who we are. And that's just one tiny sliver of that, one tiny sliver. So the fact that the overwhelming majority of people in our societies, and I include to some extent myself in this, are either uneducated or miseducated about history, is a lot of the reason we are where we are, because that context gives you the ability to be the guy who doesn't get killed by the cops, effectively, right? That context, that truth is how you know that you need to act in a particular way to get the best possible outcome in that situation. Which is why I'm just always talking about the need to teach kids history and contextualize. This is one of the things I personally was very fortunate to get from what was actually a reasonably good Soviet education system, and also my parents, you know.
All right, there's an idea that's under the surface of all this that I think, Sam, ties back to what you were talking about, that social media deranges people because you're seeing things that aren't necessarily true, but cognitive biases like recency bias, I've seen a bunch of these attacks. And so my mental model just begins to map to the things that I've seen. And so this must be true. Also maps what you're talking about, where people are steering by not what gives them predictive validity of future action, but instead, how do I make sense of the way that I feel? And if they're making sense of, oh, I see this thing and I don't like the way that it makes me feel, it must be wrong. And here is the post hoc explanation of why the baby being pulled from the rubble is wrong. Not putting it into historical context or context of what war is or anything like that. Just, I have a feeling, this feeling's not good, therefore this is bad, and I need to give some rationalization. All right, so you put that in the social media blender, and now all of a sudden, I don't know which way is up anymore, and I just react to my feelings. The reason I think this question is so important is when people don't have a method by which they determine the truth, which is about predictive validity, you will not end up running the same mathematics. So everyone needs to agree on what the outcome is that we desire, and then they have to run the scientific method. That to me is the only way that these deranging problems of our current moment of social media, plus we haven't even talked about AI, but those two things put together I think are going to be maximum in terms of their impact on derangement, because it gives everybody an N of one frame of reference. And there have been a couple times where you guys have said things that I have seen the public light you both up for, because they just disagree so violently. And
really, what would be an example with me?
Yeah, God.
I may not have noticed it because I really don't give a shit. But
yeah, so you were saying something about the Israel-Palestine conflict and the reason that people think that it's bad and that war is bad and that this has to stop. But I think the reality is there's actually two things going on. The moment you bring up Israel-Palestine, if you're talking about anything other than the following two narratives, you're not talking about the reality of why people respond the way they respond. Number one is the Norm Finkelstein stance, which nobody just addresses him head on. He does not believe Israel should exist as a state, period, end of story. Every word he says after that is predicated on Israel should not exist as a state. And if you're approaching him anyway, and people that believe what he believes, without simply debating whether Israel has a right to exist, you're arguing about the T. He's never going to agree with you. He's just going to start yelling and shouting because he has to square.
He's an example of one of these PhDs that we need not invite to the conference.
We actually just had him on, and we had a
How'd that
good
go?
hour and a half of, look, actually very useful. I think it's very useful. This is why we will continue to have some of these people on the show, because if these are people to whom a lot of other people are listening, you have to hear what they have to say.
No, but that's a self-reinforcing
Sorry, Sam.
error loop.
Let me just finish the point. You have to hear what they have to say, and then see the method that people have increasingly become addicted to is the idea that the way to get to the truth is to quote unquote destroy someone with facts and logic in a debate. I believe quite often, and this is what we try to do on the show, the way to do that is to have a conversation and just go, okay, let's hear what you have to say and let's ask you some probing questions, and then people can see for themselves the cognitive flaws in biases in what you're saying. For example, in our conversation with him and Bassem Youssef, who are two of the big anti-Israel, pro-Palestine talking heads, it became very clear that neither of them had ever thought about how this might be resolved. That's a useful piece of information to know when you're listening to these people, right? Another thing, with Norman, for example, we spent the first 20 minutes hearing his family story, and he talked about how, his parents were Stalinists, and he thought that was a bit extreme, so he's just a Maoist. That's a helpful piece of information.
Wait, was he being serious?
Yeah.
That wasn't tongue in cheek.
He's a Maoist. Yeah.
Okay.
He's a Maoist.
I would love to ask a follow-up question on that.
Do I need to then have a debate with Norman Finkelstein to destroy the idea of Maoism, or is it sufficient for most people to go, okay, that's the perspective from which he's coming?
I would like to answer that question directly. So you guys both have the right to live your life however you want according to my value system, and so I want you to thrive in ways as you define it. But I think it is incredibly important that people that have the ability to parse through things, not based on emotion, but based on predictive validity towards an agreed upon outcome that is noble and honorable. And therefore, this was something you brought up earlier, and I wanted to address, which is I would request of people that are like the two of you that you address any problem that gains sufficient momentum in culture. And so it can't be derived based on, I think this person is a good faith actor. It just can't. It has to be derived around, but this idea is gaining sufficient cultural momentum. And therefore, if I choose to step into that into the arena of helping people make sense of the world, I'm going to address these ideas. Obviously, that's an ask that I have no right to make of anybody, but that's what I want from people that I see as uniquely capable. Now, I have a frame of reference where I look at human beings as flesh-based AI, and I just want to point the Konstantin flesh-based AI at a given problem and see how he addresses it. I want to point the Sam flesh-based AI at a given problem and see how he handles it. Now, that's brought a ton of pain and suffering into both of your lives. I get that.
I don't know why you keep saying that. It
okay,
honestly
not
hasn't.
yours. No, Sam's, it certainly
pain
has.
and suffering on his podcast. For me,
yeah. So, and also there's a more deranging thing, and that thing is Sam. I have watched people on the left and right come up with really contrite ways to discredit you. And so there are people that now just memify, like one side is just, you're just obviously a racist. You don't like brown people. And so they're never going to debate you on the point of jihadism. They're just like, he hates brown people. Boom, done. You don't have to listen to Sam. He's totally fucking deranged. And then on the other side, it's Trump derangement syndrome, COVID, broke him, and they don't have to listen to you.
Right.
And those memes have gained so much momentum that now it's a pretty small group of people that can do what you guys can do. I'm going to say, 100 maybe? And like, as we start whittling people out of that pool, I get very uneasy as someone who believes that this moment actually does matter, that we are in the grips of ideas always throughout human history. Ideas rule the day. And we are now living with a deranging device in our pockets that gives us velocity and volume of information that is absolutely impossible to parse, all while having destroyed religion, which I really want to talk to you about this. I think religion, which I don't believe in, but I think religion is the only medium through which memes can travel across time and across all IQs, from a literal moron to a literal genius. Somehow, some way, religion is the medium by which the memes can propagate. And so when people cannot parse what is true, they at least previously could just check it against noble book. These noble books have terrifying problems. And so I would love Podcastistan, to use your word. I would love it to be the solution. But I'm just saying that is the thing. N of one frame of reference. Even if people agree on what the facts are, they do not agree on what the facts mean. They are not aimed at the same thing. And so when we don't have people that are capable of just walking people through the arguments and, I hate to say it, willing to face the social consequences of doing so, the crazy making just explodes. And let me ask the following to see if you guys agree with that. If there were a bill before Congress, and I know you can't vote here, but just bear with me, that forced a limitation on the amount of time that people could spend on social media, if you guys believe it's a deranging instrument, one would think you'd be for it. Would you guys be for it, or is there something that
I think
overrides?
that's a wrong way to affect the change.
I agree.
Right? I mean, that's maybe a separate conversation about just why you wouldn't want government doing that sort of thing. But I mean, I want to address the Konstantin's intuitions here about how you error correct, because I'm sure there are examples where if you just give someone enough rope, they're going to hang themselves, right? So you just flip on the mic and have the conversation. But there are many more examples of where you have platformed someone and given them access to your audience, and you even if you're doing the work of journalism, trying to debunk their errors in real time, some people are so unscrupulous and they're so facile in their shtick. I mean, this is all they do, right? This is what they're just the vaccine causes autism guy, or they're the Holocaust never happened guy, and it's just impossible to clean up the mess fast enough. It's asymmetric warfare here.
Sam, I don't want to derail your point. I just want to interject one thing that may be useful for this conversation, which is I think the work of journalism is not to have everybody on and do that with them. I think you have to pick certain people based on your perception first and foremost. The North Star for us, and I'm not saying we have always succeeded at all, but the North Star for us is, do I think this person is operating in good faith? As in, if I challenge an argument that doesn't make sense, will they respond to that with an attempt to engage with that argument, or are they going to lie and obfuscate?
Right.
Norman Finkelstein, I have to give him credit, didn't do that. I don't think he didn't answer many questions, but it was a genuine conversation. So that's different to getting someone like Alex Jones on, who's basically a character act.
Yeah, but
But carry on, please.
There are many people. So, and this is the problem with alternative media, or what I often refer to as Podcastistan or Substackistan, where I'm quite happy to be out here. I'm happy to be just accountable to no one but myself on my own podcast. But the liability here is that what there's something like 4 million podcasts now, and it's just this wilderness of information, and the kinds of messages that are getting promoted. I mean, the kinds of people who wind up on Joe Rogan's podcast, to take the most popular podcast. I mean, the range in quality and the range in attitude towards just the intellectual honesty is so vast that I do think it becomes irresponsible just to turn on the mic and talk to the guy, and you can't use the justification that so many people have prior to you have turned on, just given this guy the mic, that now you have a journalistic reason to have him on because so many people are talking about what Finkelstein is saying about the war in Gaza. I mean, he just radiates crankishness. I mean, there's a reason why this guy is a marginal figure in mainstream channels, and why I think a lot of actual scholars on the topic probably wouldn't debate him. But the problem here is so insidious, and it's very hard. It's very hard to recognize. I mean, occasionally I'll do like a post-mortem on something that's happened on someone else's podcast on my own, and I think I did this for RFK Jr. going on Jordan Peterson's podcast. So RFK Jr. is a presidential candidate. He gets whatever it is, like 20% of the vote apparently nationally. So he seems worth talking to, but I would argue the only reason why he's in that position in the first place is so many people have thought he should be talked to, and I decided not to have him on my podcast because I know he is such a confabulator. He can make a mess that you can't even detect as a mess until after the conversation is over. And so he did this to Jordan. I mean, he tells this story to Jordan about how Jake Tapper of I think at that point ABC News was working with him for 3 weeks to produce a documentary on how big pharma is just utterly corrupt. And at the last minute, the documentary was about to air, and Jake Tapper called him just inconsolable, saying, "Listen, I've been in journalism a long time. This has never happened to me, but corporate spiked the whole story." And the implication being, which he drew out in the podcast, is that big pharma got to corporate, right? So big pharma completely controls the situation. The whole story is false. Jake Tapper has been trying to debunk this for years, trying to get him to stop talking about this for years. And the last time he talked about it, Tapper wrote an article on CNN's blog, just detailing how this was just a tissue of lies. There's literally no way for Jordan, hearing that story for the first time in a podcast, to know that there's anything amiss, right? Mm-hmm. And he just absorbs it like, oh man, that's a smoking gun right there. Wow. And how many of those are going to come tumbling out of RFK's mouth? Who knows, right? The guy is confabulating. I mean, whether he's actually consciously lying or he's just so he's just uncoupled from. I mean, it comes back to the concept of bullshit. I mean, the bullshit, or the reason why the bullshit is so insidious, is that with a liar, the liar is actually tracking the truth, and he's trying to. I mean, it's malicious. He's trying to insert his lie into the space provided so that you don't detect it as a lie. And he's tracking what's true in the world. He's tracking your expectations of logical consistency. The bullshit is just talking, and I mean, so some people have a professional concession in some species of half truth or utter bullshit, and alternative media is just, and social media combined, are amplifying this stuff to the ends of the earth. So now we have to talk about, whether vaccines cause autism, and we have a presidential candidate who's banging on about this. He also thinks that maybe the HIV virus doesn't cause AIDS, right? It's like these are the kinds of things that get spoken about to an audience, to an uneducated audience of tens of millions on Rogan's podcast and others, and it's dysfunctional, and it's not what we used to have. Again, it was a flawed system, but we still have within the ivory tower and within certain journalistic organs, we have a set of rules and editorial standards where we're going to say, all right, listen, we have to fact check this before this goes out. We just don't run with this live. This is we have to do enough journalistic due diligence in advance of the conversation. We have to have noticed all the things this person has gotten wrong before they ever come to our microphone, and we have to hit them with that stuff so that we can sort of pre-bunk a lot of the bullshit that's going to come out in this conversation. And if you're not doing that, I do think it is irresponsible on important issues, right? It's good theater on unimportant issues, but when things are important, when lives hang in the balance, when you're influencing an electorate of who's going to be president or whether they're going to support the next war or stop the next war, I just think it's again we're slow to realize the influence of many of our platforms. We're reaching millions of people.
No, I agree with you. May I just,
Please,
on this, I agree with you. And actually the prediction I would make is I think the era of the, I agree with you podcast is kind of, I think that's coming to an end. I think the next step is going to be people having disagreements and doing that in good faith, ideally. But the question is, I guess my question to you, Sam, would be, if you feel that that's necessary, you're in the perfect place to do that job. You're someone who's big enough.
I just pick my battles. I mean, it's either the Venn diagram for me is it interesting and important? I mean, sometimes I'll just go with interesting. I mean, I'll talk about physics and it's just for fun. But on this kind of, and the question is it too much of an opportunity cost? Is it going to take me a month of my life to prepare for this podcast, or is it even possible to do adequately given a person's capacity to just refer to stuff that may not exist? And some people are unscrupulous enough that I have just seen in advance that there are enough reasons just not to talk to the person and not to take them seriously, that taking them seriously is already the initial error that no high quality debunking of their bullshit is going to overcome.
But the reason we are where we are is largely driven by technology. You're not going to put new media back in the tube, right? That's toothpaste is out. It's out there. People are going to have those conversations whether you like that or not. And I guess what I'm saying to you is, given that a lot of people, take your RFK example, given that a lot of people have hosted him on their shows and he wants to come on your show, I think you have a unique...
So what I did is I just took a half hour on my show detailing why I wasn't having him on the show, and I told the story about Jordan's podcast and a few other things.
Yeah, but that isn't the same as engaging with a real human in a conversation in which you could combine a good faith approach, which you generally always have, I would say. You could say, I'm going to approach this in good faith, and at the same time, in good faith, I have noticed these things that are fundamentally untrue or misleading or whatever about things that you have said, and let's sit down for a sufficient period of time in which we can actually explore that. Because the reason I'm saying this is I think that the idea that someone is out there being talked to in front of millions of people, and the solution to that is either to ignore them, or I'm not saying this is how I think about it, I'm just saying how it might be perceived, to snipe from the sidelines is not going to fix that problem. And that problem is largely technology driven anyway. So I feel like you in particular, I'm less qualified to talk about many things, particularly scientific things, but you in particular have a unique opportunity where you can actually say, well, look, maybe it is going to take me a month of my time, but this guy is polling at 20% with the American public. No one else is going to do this. I'm going to dedicate that time and actually address this with the person where they have a chance to actually respond, and the back and forth. And then if the audience can see that they're not answering your good faith, good-mannered, good-natured, but fact-seeking questions, that's going to be very informative to a lot of people.
Yeah, again, I pick my battles, and it really is it's a triage situation. I mean, there are lots of things to debate, and
is that really true, Sam?
And some things are undebatable. I mean, I'm not going to debate someone who thinks that. I've had these debates in the past. It's like the history here is relevant. I mean, there's so many topics on which I've basically said everything I have to say, and I get dragged back to the topic again because it's in the connection between Islamic terrorism and some actual tenets within the real religion of Islam, right? Like, so the problem of jihadism and Islamism more generally. Like I've had, since October 7th, I've had to spend some hours on my podcast both talking about that solo and having people on who disagree with me. I'd be very happy never to speak about that stuff again. I've debated, Christian fundamentalists, and I've debated people about, lots of things that where I think there's not much of a debate, right? Like now, there's no reason for me to talk to a creationist about evolution anymore. Like, I've done that. Can
we come back to the Islamic terrorism point?
Yeah.
Because I think actually that's where, sorry that I'm taking over here.
But I love this, by all means.
If you want to reach your full potential this year, you have got to focus on providing yourself with the best possible building blocks for your brain and body. And that is why I recommend ButcherBox. You guys know ButcherBox is a huge part of my life because they go above and beyond to source only high quality and humanely raised meats and seafood. This includes 100% grass-fed beef, free-range organic chicken, humanely raised pork, and wild-caught seafood, all shipped for free and delivered directly to your door. This year, get exactly what you need to hit your healthy eating goals. ButcherBox is offering our listeners their choice of meat,
salmon, chicken breast, or steak tips
for free in every order for a whole year. Plus, get $20 off your first order. Sign up today for this incredible offer at butcherbox.com/impact and use code IMPACT to choose your free offer and get $20 off.
Because I think the work you have done on that issue has been, I can't overestimate its importance, because you're countering bad ideas that people have out there where there's a complete failure to analyze the reality and to make appropriate comparisons. For example, when I heard you talk about, what Hamas did on October 7th, people compare it to America's reaction to 9/11 or whatever, right? Except America didn't drag women through the streets of New York City. You talked about this, right? It's a very powerful way of debunking something. And this is the point I'm making to you. Whether you like it or not, the idea is out there. RFK is out there. And no matter how distasteful you may find those things, ignoring it, and even you doing a half-an-hour podcast in it, is not going to make the same impact as you attacking that issue directly with the person. I appreciate really, truly that. And you know how when we had the conversation on our podcast that ended up blowing up in your face and whatever, I hope you know that, I think you do know that Francis and I really were not involved in that, didn't enjoy that, we're not happy about it, and frankly were quite disgusted by some of the way that people reacted, right? So this isn't me trying to put you back in the firing line of all that crap. But on the other hand, I am kind of speaking to your potential greatness in that area. You are uniquely placed to address some of these arguments. And I know that you don't necessarily always want to go back into that shit fest. But on the other hand, I think the work you can do on some of those issues is really important. And I just, as a fan, would invite you, if you feel that someone like RFK is polling at 20% and is talking shit, I really think, forgive me for saying this, I think you have a duty to take that on. I really do.
Well, on the specific point of his anti-vaccine stance, I know he doesn't want to answer to the name of being anti-vaccines, but that's definitely the net result of what he says about this. I just think it's not. I'm just the wrong guy to do it. I could do the homework and do a credible job of it, but the real people to do it are, vaccinologists, immunologists.
Yeah, none of them have an audience. You do.
Well, no, but the way to do it is to set up, is to pair him with somebody and moderate
Correct.
it. And I thought, and there were efforts afoot to do that. I'm not quite sure with people more qualified than me to do it, and to even do it on a bigger platform like Rogan's. I'm not quite sure why those petered out. But I just think I don't think it's important to focus on RFK in particular at the moment.
So I'll push this one last thing and then we'll leave it alone. So like Konstantin, I believe you uniquely are capable of this, even if you need an immunologist there with you to debunk it, partly because of your credibility, partly because you're one of the only people I know that can think in literal straight lines. And so it's very easy to track what you're trying to say. I wish I could do that. I think in fractals, I find it very hard to speak in straight lines. So that would be huge. This is why I was making an appeal for have some barometer. So I would beg of you to make it popularity and culture, that we say, hey, Sam Harris, we know he's going to touch anything, even if he has to get somebody else to come on the show to join him, whatever. But anything that cracks a certain level, he's going to have on. And I think I really want you to do outreach to the people that are center left and center right that have been given memes by which to discredit you. You won't get far right, far left. I get that. But I think that there are people on either side that it will really help the zeitgeist if you can win them over. And part of why I think the clip on trigonometry popped off was, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but part of what you were saying was when you're in the middle of a political game and you know the other side is playing that game, you should use those tactics as well. And so if we need to slow roll looking at it, obviously don't lie. You were very clear about that. But that you can't just let an October surprise land and just be like, oh, well, gee, I guess we have to deal with it. Like, you have to understand that was gamesmanship and you have to be wise in the way that you handle it. And so it feels, that is the first time I'm like, ooh, maybe, and now I'm speaking as myself, but I think this is very much echoed by other people, where I'm like, oh, Sam, anybody else, I wouldn't hold to the standard, but you, I need to know that you're the, God's so not fair to ask of you, but like you're the person who will suffer the slings and arrows to not do the violent uprising, you know, all the people that were just like, I'm going to let the dogs come and bite me, and I'm going to be the one that is steadfast through it, has a belief system, and just sticks with it. And there are shades of that when you won't engage with RFK, who is clear. So speaking for myself, brother, I cannot bring myself to vote for somebody who has clear signs of cognitive decline. And I really don't want to vote for somebody that has clear signs of narcissism and being a threat to not doing a peaceful transfer of power. Like both of those just seem like non-starter answers. And so I have found myself more and more drawn to RFK in the limited amount that I've researched him, admittedly not a lot. I'm trying to get him on the show though as fast as I can. And I am doing that in part because you're not. People that I think will really be able to do this thoughtfully are not. And so yeah, that I get that that's an unreasonable ask to make, but I think that, man, the world would be in a better place.
Well, one thing we should observe here is, I mean, there are so many asymmetries that are just not helpful. There's what we're suffering. I mean, this is the West in general is suffering this, but you know, our elite institutions are suffering this. It is possible to weaponize the high integrity values of a culture against that culture. Right. So if, you know, in the West, we prize tolerance of diversity and freedom of thought, and we welcome, you know, refugees. You know, we understand that luck has not been spread equally over the surface of the earth, and we find the disparities in luck intolerable. So we want to welcome the unluckiest people in the world who are suffering political violence and oppression into our society if they want to rebuild their lives here. But all of those defaults are noble. We don't want to get rid of them. They're at the core of our ethical integrity and our political stability, and et cetera, et cetera. All of that can be weaponized against us by cynical and even evil people, right? So, and it is in fact being done against us by jihadists and Islamists, and to a great effect in Western Europe, to a lesser effect in America. But it's still just we have to see that this is our political and ethical source code has a flaw in it. It's easily hacked. You can. It's just we know. I mean, there's so many examples of this, but like, you know, Al Qaeda members were trained to know that if they were ever caught and put in prison, they could claim to be tortured, and Amnesty International would show up and gum up the whole works, and their, you know, infidel enemies would just torture themselves with their own, you know, ethical scruples, trying to figure out whether any of these guys had been tortured, and I mean, it's just, and they laughed about this, right? I mean, this is you can extrapolate that to 100 different cases. That it is possible to weaponize high ethical integrity against those who have the integrity.
But this is why you don't want RFK.
No. So I'm giving you just various examples of this. So like, the Rudy Giuliani moment was a moment of that, where it's like our sense is, if this laptop is real, the New York Times has a journalistic duty to get to the bottom of it, and any hesitation to do that is a pathological sign of political partisanship, right? Like it's a failure of journalism. You have to Rudy Giuliani shows up with this awful laptop at the hour of his choosing, and you, the New York Times, based on your journalistic integrity, just need to open your mouth and eat it, right? And I viewed that as an instance of high integrity values being weaponized against our establishment in a way that could have actually decided the election based on what we knew, you know, from the prior election, what James Comey's opening up Hillary Clinton's emails did in real time over those last 10 days. And again, I admitted on your podcast, I thought it was a hard call. I called it a coin toss several times, but that didn't make it into that clip. So I was genuinely conflicted over what, you know, journalists should do. And I didn't think Twitter should have frozen the account of the New York Post that ran with the story. But there was definitely an argument to slow walk that, knowing that Giuliani is this, cynical political operative who picked his moment as an October surprise, and the laptop was still going to be there in 12 days, right? And there was probably not enough time to get there. There still hasn't been enough time to really get to the bottom of it, because there's nothing's coming out of that laptop.
I get all
of
this,
any
and
importance,
you've litigated
right?
this many times, and I think your points are very clear, but people still feel some kind of way. And this goes back to, we're living in conspiracy land, and when people get a whiff of, you don't want to talk to RFK, they just start going conspiracy land about why you don't want to. There's
a lack of credibility. There's an obviousness of certain errors. There's a lack of awareness of those errors on his part and the part of the people who support him. It's like it's the same. I mean, there's so many topics I'm not inclined to touch, because the smell of bullshit is detectable far enough off that you just don't have to spend time with it.
But I think the point Tom is making, and I'm making to you both, and Tom, tell me if it's not the point you're making, is that you are in a position to smell that bullshit where other people may be drawn in by it, and the world would benefit from you, diving headfirst into the bullshit to help other people see that as bullshit, and litigating that in the public eye for other people to learn from. I guess what we're getting at...
Except it's amazing how rare it is. I mean, I'm not saying that debates and debunkings don't matter, but it's just amazing how hard it is to change people's minds once they've dug in on certain
points. It's very hard.
It's like I've debated, you try to get a 9/11 truther to admit that all of those unconnected anomalies they found in on that day don't add up to a plausible story. I mean, you can spend hours and hours and hours and hours and get absolutely nowhere.
Sure, but if a 9/11 truther...
16% of Americans claim to believe that it was an inside job.
Yeah, and 8% of Americans or 7% of Americans think chocolate milk comes from brown cows. That's not my point.
And yet 0% of UK Muslims think homosexuality is acceptable.
I don't know if it's zero.
It was the last poll I saw was zero.
Anyway, we're getting sidetracked. The point, I think, is that if a 9/11 truther was running on a platform of 9/11 trutherism and polling at 20%, there's no one in America I would rather have than someone who's qualified to have that conversation with a large audience to deal with that. And what I'm saying is, ultimately, is kind of an invitation, begging, stroke challenge to you, is to recognize that you are in a unique position, and the unwillingness to dive into that is, I don't think it's helpful. Genuinely.
I think we are at the point where convincing Sam to do the
if you
interview.
can't convince me to do the interview, I can't convince
of how hard it is to change someone's mind.
Right. No, but this isn't a Sam specific point. We're only having this conversation because we're here, and I hope we're friends, right? What I'm saying is, there is a structural issue that is not going away. The Podcastistan thing, the Substackistan thing, it's not going away. No one is going to shut it down. There's not going to be regulation that stops it. We are past the point of no return on that. If we recognize that there's a fragmentation of reality happening, and you are in a position, I'm not talking about you, let's say me, let's say you, other people. If we're in a position to do anything possible to try and reorientate those conversations towards whatever that North Star is, in this case, truth, or an attempt to garner what reality is. Yep. If people are being put in front of tens of millions of people, the answer cannot be to simply sit in our ivory towers and to look down on that and to say, oh, that's bullshit. I
just think we're going to have to rediscover some of the same standards of journalism and intellectual honesty and integrity that the old institutions imperfectly embodied.
But who's we? Who's the we here?
The people out here on podcasts and on Substack newsletters.
But that's why I keep saying this to you, right?
That's you saying that he does that. So here's one thing that maybe I can short circuit this just to keep it tight. Sam has made very clear, not here today, but elsewhere, that everybody that does a podcast is making an editorial choice. He's explained to us why he's not going to do RFK and a million other ones. We want him to for reasons I think we've articulated. So I don't think we're going to make progress there. But if you do zoom back out and you say, okay, then what is the path forward? You're saying that we will rediscover journalistic integrity. You're, I think, maybe skeptical that where the hell is that going to happen?
I'm actually saying a very similar thing. I'm just saying, given that we are people who have large audiences, I think when we talk about we have to discover, we have to look inward and say, well, if this is out there, I have to find a way of dealing with it that is appropriate to what I believe is the right way of approaching it. So to me, I think part of that is you pick people who are saying things that you're not sure about and you engage with them critically, but from a good faith place. You pick carefully the people. There are certain people with whim you can't do that.
Right. He's just saying RFK is one of the people you can't do that with, not with his desires.
I don't think it's important. If it really seemed like he could be president, then I would probably dig in and do the work.
Well, maybe we're agreeing more than I realized because I'm highly disagreeable. But I guess what I'm saying is I think that all of us who are in this space have a duty to not only talk about the change we want to see in the world, but to actually be it.
I agree. I just think that there are so many different types of podcasts so for instance, Joe Rogan should just keep being Joe Rogan. So he's going to have people come on. I was aghast that he just kept pushing Cat Williams, say more about what the claims per second were bordering on Alex Jones levels, where they were just things I was so confused by. Now, maybe I'm wrong about all of them, and Cat is right, but there was no push back and forth. Now,
now you're doing it.
But what I'm saying is that's what Joe should do. Joe should have the kind of podcast that he wants to have, and it was actually really instructive as a host to hear him just continue to open doors for Cat to say more about something, to expand on a point. It was utterly fascinating. It felt like I was watching an improv comedian who knows the yes and. And so Cat would say something that to my potentially 10 ears just sounded crazy. And Joe was just tell me more. Oh, I haven't heard that. Where does that go? Never once being space aliens didn't come on Cat spaceships. I mean, he didn't say that. I'm just saying that's how some of the claims sounded to my, again, potentially wildly uneducated ears. But he just kept opening door after door after door.
Do you think he should have Trump on this podcast?
Yes.
Yes,
now,
I don't.
I'm saying that from
I think that would be a disaster. I mean, I think if he did it, he would have a responsibility to actually do a lot of prep and be able to hold him to some kind of journalistic accounting in that format.
Do you clock Joe Rogan as entertainment or education?
Well, both. And, Joe, I mean, I love Joe. Joe's a friend. And but what's happened to his podcast is it's become so big. It's a window onto the attention of so many millions of people and disproportionately young and misinformed on many crucial points. And there's a responsibility that comes with that. And he personally always has the out of saying, listen, I'm just a fucking comic and I'm stoned half the time. This is just for fun. I'm just having these conversations and you get to enjoy them. And he pulls the ripcord. But there are certain circumstances where it really matters that there be some guardrails, and it's giving Trump a 4-hour basically campaign commercial in front of probably 40 million people in the end, and letting him just lie and bullshit and freewheel and basically turn it into a campaign event. That would be irresponsible. It just would be.
Well, from what I understand, Joe has said he doesn't want to have Donald Trump on for that very reason.
So I think
I would happily have Donald Trump on because we would challenge him.
Right. Okay. But the moment that we acknowledge that, and I know Joe has said in the past that he has declined to have Trump on, even Joe recognizes there that you have to be, some caution is warranted. You can't. It's not just that if you just let someone talk long enough, they're going to hang themselves to your audience. Your audience is always smart enough to detect lies and misinformation. It's just not true. Even the host who's done homework isn't always smart enough to do that. And if you do no homework, you're definitely not going to be. So it's. I just think that now we're just talking about where the line is, and is it irresponsible to put Alex Jones on and have him bloviate and find it funny. it could be a matter of taste. I think it was irresponsible when he was out there telling people that Sandy Hook hadn't happened, and he had a lunatic cult behind him who was actually targeting the parents of those murdered kids. I mean, so that was irresponsible, and he got sued for it. I think rightly so. But yeah, I mean, on some level, it's a matter of just it's a judgment call, and you can't actually draw a bright line between this is obviously good and worth doing, and this is obviously an irresponsible waste of time.
Yeah, to me, it's the base assumption driving all of my thinking is that any one person is going to be horrendously bad at deciding what is true and what ought to be talked about. And so we should let whoever wants to talk go out and talk in whatever method they want. And yes, people are going to have to discern what do I turn to this person for? And the only reason that I was so interested in having the conversation about you and RFK is I turned to you for those things.
Right.
I turned to Joe to bring me fascinating people. And look, make no mistake about it. I think Joe is the best of us. And I'm utterly blown away by what he's able to do because it's this utterly fascinating blend of education and entertainment. And he can switch back and forth. Now, to get somebody like him, I have to accept that sometimes a person that he has on that I feel he should be more confrontational, more educational, he just, for whatever reason, that day woke up and chose entertainment. Great, fair enough. Who am I to coach this guy from the sidelines? So I want to see all ideas out in the marketplace, and I want to see.
But you're
those
not. It
ideas
sounds to
out.
me like you're not acknowledging another dynamic here, which is the kind of reputational laundering of people
No,
in
I'm
these
saying
contexts.
everything's a trade-off. So there is no final solution. I think the three of us have all quoted Thomas Sowell. There are no solutions, only trade-offs. And so if you make the decision, we need editorial content, people have to be held to a standard, that's a certain trade-off. If you're like, I want to make sure all ideas get out there, I think you and I might wildly disagree about Brett Weinstein and what happened during COVID. My thing was, I was getting so freaked out by my trigger, which is authoritarian top-down rule. That's just, I'm wired to have a real fucking problem with that. And I saw people trying to silence credible voices. Now, you may think this credible voice has got this all fucking wrong and audience capture, and he's derailing. But with Tom Bilyeu's value system, my frame of reference, I'm like, you cannot fucking silence that person. Like, I'm just hard stop, end of story. Just that is the one thing I will say you have to take off the table. That's my approach. It could be broken. And I will certainly, again, I have a North Star and I'm constantly running the scientific method. Is my belief system and the way that I move through the world leading us there? That remains the question.
Just one tiny point on that. That's why I keep trying to get us all to point the finger at ourselves and go, if I don't agree with this particular way of doing things, how can I do this better? Ultimately, that's how this gets solved. It's not going to get solved by us criticizing other people. They're not going to change what they do because the three of us had a go at them. This is not how people work, generally speaking, right? So that's why I think if, to the extent that you have an ability to impact that, that's where actually we are able to be useful.
All right, I want to point these two high-powered voices at something you guys brought up earlier, which is the death or the suicide of the West, however you want to think about it. Why, if you believe that the West is worthy of defense, what is it about the West that makes it worthy of defense?
Well, it's many of the values we've mentioned here. I mean, what we have in the West and it's been fairly hard won. I mean, we have brushed back a tendency to theocracy in a Christian context. I mean, for more than 1,000 years, we had this just stark antagonism to scientific understanding and individual rights, and and we pried all that loose from, I would argue, completely false religious certainty, to the point where now we have secular societies that are open societies, right? Where, at least in principle, we're in a circumstance where the best idea can win, right? Where we can talk about things in good faith, and we have the political freedom to do that. No one's getting thrown in prison by the state for anything they've said. I mean, this is especially true in America, and all of that is a machine of error correction, and it allows for the solution of all kinds of coordination problems that only good faith, well-disposed cooperators can achieve together. And so I don't think it's an accident that democracy, the combination of democracy and capitalism and political freedom, has been this engine of wealth and creativity, and we should want to defend that, because the alternatives, all the alternatives that we know about suck, right? I mean, just where you have an ideology that captures everything with top-down control of individual behavior, and you try to make an economy run on those rails, or you try to make a political system conform, and you have all of these awful experiments that we've seen, communism being salient, but obviously fascism, all these variants that we're right not to want. And what we have coming, over the transom and up through the floor is a political movement and a religious tidal wave, really, of religious conviction coming into Western society, which is using our values against us, right? Our values of tolerance, our values of openness, our values of wanting to help, and our values of self-criticism, where we have looked back on our history of colonialism and racism and all of our tendencies to xenophobia and selfishness, and we have grown sufficiently embarrassed by that, rightly so, and critical of that, rightly so, and not disposed to ever make those mistakes again, rightly so, and now we have genuine bad actors who know that whenever they merely use the term racism, that settles all arguments, at least left of center in our politics, right? You just call someone a racist and you've won. You've revealed them to be a racist, and you've won the argument. And we have Islamist stealth groups in every Western society, certainly in America and the UK, really trying to advance a theocratic agenda. We have Qatar, which is literally the largest funder of universities in Britain and America now, more than any other country on earth. Qatar, which is governed by a theology that comes straight out of the Muslim Brotherhood. All of this is insidious. All of this is in part what explains the frank delusion of our ostensibly most educated kids in the country, when in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, literally before Israel had done anything in response. This has nothing to do with dead babies in Gaza. This has to do with a knee-jerk reaction against Israel being the bad guys, even when you had over 1,000 people, innocent for the most part, peace activists, murdered in their bedrooms at dawn by a genocidal death cult. Our smartest kids, who spending $90,000 a year on tuition, couldn't figure out who the bad guys were on October 7th. We are the victim of a kind of psyop, and it's our own values that are being weaponized against us.
How is the psyop running, Konstantin? What is it that it peristetizes in our mind? Is it just distance from the winning of all these freedoms? Is it something else?
Well, let me come back and just first talk a little bit about the West and what I think makes it great. I think Sam did a great job of outlining a lot of that. I would just maybe build a little bit on some of the things you said. And one of them is, it is my experience that people in the West fundamentally do not understand, even remotely, how unique what we have in the West is, particularly when it comes to individual rights. I mean, we live in a world in which if you accumulate wealth as you have, that's your wealth. You're protected. This is not the case in most of the rest of the world today. There is no private property at a high level in Russia. Mikhail Khodorkovsky was the richest man in Russia. And the moment he tried to say anything about, he just tried to give some money to an opposition party that was against Vladimir Putin. He ceased being the richest man in Russia almost immediately and went to prison for 10 years, to a penal colony, eventually exiled. The same is true in China. Yeah. Jack Ma, billionaire, criticizes banking regulations, not banking regulations, disappears for a year, not heard of, not heard from for.
It came back no longer criticizing.
Came back with a very
regulations.
different opinion, just magically. And there are other people like that, but Bao Mao, I can't remember the other guy's name. These are just examples of something that is routine. So the idea, and this is why our system works. This isn't like, oh, it's nice that billionaires can keep that. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, our system works because the incentive structure works. The incentive structure in Russia or in China is not to create things of value to other people and therefore become rich, as you have done. It is to serve the system, to serve the people above you, to serve the people above you in the hierarchy, in their corrupt needs. If you do that, you will become rich in Russia, or you will retain your wealth in Russia. And if you fail to do that, you will cease to be rich in Russia. So the reason our system works is because we have created incentive structures that take us forward, that mean that talented, inventive, creative, driven, passionate, smart people can profit from that talent, can profit from their own hard work and retain what they create. The same is true on almost every level. I mean, our technological progress, this is a self-evident thing that smart people don't talk about, but I feel like sometimes it needs explaining. The reason the West is so technologically superior is not disconnected from its culture of freedom of the individual. I mean, this should be obvious to people, but for some reason we don't talk about it nearly enough. The reason we are the most technically advanced society in the world and in the history of the world is partly because we allow people to pursue their curious interest and to profit from them if they create something of value to other people. So I think sometimes when we talk about this idea of individual freedom, we talk about them in a kind of moral sense, like, oh, it's good, it's obviously good, it's obviously good for people to be free. Well, actually, yes, and also there are some very practical consequences of that freedom that are the reason we are where we are. So that's just a little bit of why I think the West is unique and it's worth protecting. And, you know, we've used the word experiment a lot, talking about communism and others. We should be honest, liberal democracy is an experiment, and a very recent one, So, like all new ideas, it can go off the rails very easily if the core of what made it what it is not maintained. And I think the reason that many of us have been speaking up about this for some time now, and the reason I wrote my book and many other people have been talking about this, is I think we're abandoning the things that made us who we are, and we're abandoning some of the things which we ultimately, after centuries of struggle and bloodshed and violence and disagreement, we actually were starting to reach a place where we were identifying some of the memes, as you like to call them, that work in the type of society that we want to create. The idea that people should be treated on the content of their character was a meme that was developed through a lot of pain and a lot of suffering and a lot of violence and a lot of discrimination and a lot of awful treatment of, in that particular case, black people. But if you go to other parts of the West, there would have been other ways of conceptualizing that still exist, right? And we eventually came to the idea that actually that ancient thing that is so hardwired into us, the tribalism, the you know, call it racism, call it xenophobia, whatever, it's just in-group, out-group, right? That thing that is hardwired into us. We have an intellectual idea that can sit on top of that can mitigate a lot of that. That's incredible. It's an incredible, I mean, this idea doesn't exist in China. The idea that people are to be treated equally, irrespective of their race or ethnicity or religion. And I wrote a whole piece on my Substack a while ago about talking about this. And I just gave example after example of, you know, in China, we talk about racism all the time in the UK, for example, right? And I just gave an example of a commercial in China where a Chinese girl is doing the laundry and a black guy comes up to her and he starts flirting with her. And she's like, ugh. She shoves him into the washing machine, puts this product that's being advertised in, and guess what the payoff is? He comes out Chinese.
Whoa.
Right? Yeah. This is not a long time ago, and it explains to you why they have 1 million Chinese Uyghurs in concentration camps, right? The idea that all ethnic groups are to be treated equally does not exist in Russia, not even remotely. And Russia is, to a large extent, a multi-ethnic country. It has large Muslim populations, it has large ethnic minority populations. The idea that they are the same as everybody else would seem absurd. to anybody. In most parts of the world, the idea that gay people should be treated the same as stray people, you would be laughed out of the room. People don't like hearing this in the West because they can't process that reality. But it's like, this endlessly joked about queers for Palestine thing. They will throw you off a fucking roof. That's what they're going to do to you.
Yeah.
Right? And from that extreme, you can work your way down. Most of the rest of the world, they're not going to throw you off a roof, but you're not going to be treated equally. So we struggled and we fought and we went through a lot of horror to get to that place. And the symptom of that unraveling that I'm deeply troubled by is that we are doing the exact opposite. DEI is the exact opposite of that idea. And it's embedded in every institution now. The idea that you can pick people, you can say this group has got better outcomes than that group. That means, and we need to treat these people better than these other people, right? It doesn't matter which way you play that dynamic. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if it's you put black people at the top, white people at the bottom, brown people at the top, black people. It doesn't matter how you play that game. It always leads to bad outcomes. And the reason that anti-Semitism now is becoming much more prominent is a natural reflection of that worldview. It's a reflection of the worldview in which successful people are successful by virtue of privilege or corruption or abuse of others, and unsuccessful groups or groups that don't do as well in certain fields are there because they have been abused, because they've been taken advantage of. Once you implement that, every successful minority is going to be in the firing line, whether that's Jews, whether that's Asian Americans, whether that's African Americans who are first generation from Africa, right? They're incredibly successful in America. You're going to see all these groups being attacked in some way, whether that's in words or other ways, because we are breaking the thing that made us who we are.
Okay, so assuming that gets embedded in the mind on the back of compassion, essentially.
Yep.
Like, look at these people, you can't leave them behind. Something I've talked about on my podcast before, because my mom was in transportation in a high school back where I grew up. There was this law passed called McKinney-Vento, where no child left behind. And they would drive a single school bus 2 hours one way to pick up one kid and bring him back. And I was like, that is compassion turned pathological. Like, that's nonsensical. How do we flip that idea? Because you're definitely not going to get people to buy into something that makes them feel discompassionate.
I think that, look, we come back right to where we started. I think we have to be able to. We have to live in the real world. If we do not live in the real world, we will not survive. And when I say survive, I don't mean that we're all going to die tomorrow. What I mean is there's a difference between Rome and Italy. Ancient Rome, the great civilization, and Italy, which lives on the ruins. I don't mean this to insult my Italian friends. There's a difference between being a great civilization and selling trinkets on the ruins of that great civilization 2,000 years later. It's a big fucking difference. And every American is going to feel that, and every person in the West is going to feel that if we allow our culture to deteriorate to that point. So unless we orientate towards truth, which is the balance between empathy and compassion and pragmatism, that's where that place is, we will not survive. And that's why I keep telling people these depressing things, because unless we get a grasp of where we're heading, I don't think we're going to correct the course. I really don't.
Well, it's also a matter of just consistency. I mean, I think the most effective way of arguing against these extreme positions is to show their internal inconsistencies and the reductio ad absurdum. So, I mean, so on the left, you take the woke left, they're highly sensitized toward around variables like racism and homophobia and political inequality between men and women, say, right? So you take a feminist activist who is all in for Palestine, not especially disposed to think about who Hamas really is, right? And yet can effortlessly see that she's against a white supremacist, theocratic Nazi cult, right? If these were white Christian nationalist, theocrat Nazis who thought women should stay in the house as breeders and just baking and having kids, and that and they express nothing but xenophobia and anti-Semitism and white supremacy. That's all instantly recognizable as evil, and yet you can connect all of those dots for Hamas or any other jihadist or even Islamist organization, and that's exactly who they are. It's exactly who the Muslim Brotherhood is, right? It's exactly some of these groups that are actually funding Middle East studies departments at Georgetown and Princeton. That's who these guys are, right? So the left should be able to see the internal inconsistency. They should be able to see that if they're for women's rights, they're against 98% of girls in Somalia getting clitorectomies, right?
Whoa.
Or women in Iran deciding to take off the veil and being thrown into prison and tortured and raped and even killed for having dared to show their hair, right? And the most obscene distortions of moral intuition here can be seen in moments like when Linda Sarsour, this hijabi theocrat bully, gets picked as one of the women to anchor the Women's March, right? She's wearing, Shepard Fairey does a hijabi poster, and the very symbol of essentially gender apartheid throughout the Muslim world is co-opted as a symbol of women's empowerment in the West, right? This is, it's just a complete nullification of moral intelligence and the very real solidarity that should be obvious between women who care about their rights in the West and the women they ostensibly care about in the Muslim world who are being thrown in prison for taking the hijab off. It's just the confusion is so obvious. It's so right on the surface. Eventually, people will be embarrassed by this. Insofar as culture is incapable of improving itself, and we know it is, there's going to come a time when with all these girls from Barnard and Columbia and Brandeis and all these liberal institutions are going to be embarrassed to look back at how they just got confused about the valence of religious symbols, who their friends were, who their enemies were at moment. It is as upside down as anything awful in our racist past, and it has the additional variable of being masochistic. It's like, at least with old school racist outgroup hatred, it was your attack. The victims are others, but what's happened in the West. To take another example from the UK, like the Rotherham scandal, right, where you have literally over 1,000 English girls, some of whom are 12 years old, getting raped by mostly Pakistani men, and no one is doing anything about it because everyone's afraid to be called racist. So literally, the parents would come into the police station and say, "My daughter was just gang raped by a bunch of taxi drivers," and it wouldn't be prosecuted because the police department was so afraid of being called racist. The optics of the problem was so intolerable that everyone was allergic to it. It's this kind of masochism that is going to undo the West, and it's going to undo I've been saying this for 20 years, and I think hopefully this will never come true, but we're seeing the signs of it coming true. Insofar as the left can't get its head screwed on straight around this specific variable of Islamism and jihadism, it will potentiate right-wing populism and a thirst for right-wing authoritarianism across the West, and we will have fascist governments because, as David Frum once said, if liberals won't police borders, fascists will, and that's where we're headed unless we talk some sense to ourselves on that topic.
What were we going to say?
Well, I was just going to say, I completely agree with that because, look, ultimately, I have a piece coming out shortly about this. I spent a few weeks with Jordan on tour, and I honestly understood why he talked about order and chaos so much. And ultimately, a few things I've seen and experienced have made me, if you ratchet up the chaos enough, People will crave order so much they're not going to give a shit who's giving it to them. And this is why I think the only way culturally to solve this problem is you have to make the core Western ideals cool again. They have to be cool. It has to be uncool to be one of these woke people with blue hair. It has to be uncool to have the idea that different groups should be treated differently. It has to be, it's like, why are you being like that? Do you know what I mean? That's what we have to do. Otherwise, it's going to be the option that Sam described. I mean, what is happening? I get very irritated when people say things like, "Well, we're giving all this money to Ukraine, but we can't even police our own border. Why does?" Just like the homelessness in LA that you drive past here every day, just like all sorts of other social problems, this isn't a money problem. It's an ideology problem, right? And until we get that ideology out of power and replace it with one that is more sensible, we are going to ratchet up the chaos more and more, and then the forces of order are going to come back. And that's the story as old as time. We are constantly in the tension, and as I think you articulated last time I was here, when we interviewed you, that balance is necessary between all things. There is a balance to be struck between chaos and order. This is why conservatives often think I'm a conservative, and they get really disappointed when they find I'm not. And people on the left accuse me of being a conservative, even though I'm not. And it's not because I love order and I hate chaos. I'm actually very open to a bit of chaos. I used to be a stand-up. I like making offensive jokes. I'm pro-legalizing some drugs. On all sorts of issues, I like opening up the cultural space. But if you have a lack of order and an abundance of chaos, that's where we're heading, and that's why I'm going. There's too much chaos going on. We've got to be careful, not only because there's a balance that we need, but also if you mess with this, you do not know the forces that you're going to unleash. You do not know the forces you're going to unleash, because what's happening with borders in the UK, that's crazy. What's happening in this country with the southern border, that's crazy. You can't have that and expect people to just sit on their hands. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
And the truth is, it's not actually in tension with real compassion, right? Like, you can have the most compassionate immigration policy you want. You still want to implement it in an orderly way. You still want to know who's coming in. You want to be able to let in all the people you actually want in. And if that's 10 million refugees, well, then let it be 10 million refugees. But at least know who's coming into the country, right? So you can. I've never heard a defense of this specific form of chaos. To take immigration as one example, it's like there's no reason for us to have this status quo, and
there's no reason we ought to, or there's no reason to explain why it is.
Well, I mean, logistically, it could just be too hard. I don't know that anyone has actually made the case that actually one person on my podcast made the case that it's actually physically impossible to have a non-porous border. I'm not sure I believe that.
Come on.
But his argument was, when the irony is, or the paradox is, as you specifically with our southern border, as you create the infrastructure. You build the wall, you build roads to the wall so that you can build the wall. You're actually making it easier and easier to get right to the border so that you can actually go under the wall or over the wall.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like an incentive thing. So you have to change the incentive. So I don't know what all the things Biden signed into law when he came into office, but supposedly there was some 50-some things that he did that made it more appealing to be somebody coming across the border.
But putting families in cages and separating kids from their families and such that we can't even reunite them even after a year was not a solution either. I mean, whatever remedy, however we close the border, it can't look like this just dystopian horror show where you've got people, genuinely desperate people who are just trying to seek a better life in cages and separated from their kids, right? So we have to figure.
I know nothing about that part of this story. I don't know why it has to escalate to people in cages, but show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome, right? So there's obviously some incentive has changed. And then also I don't think people understand that if you create an incentive, people are going to take advantage of it. And so
but one incentive that got changed was, listen, it's no longer true that if you get to the border, you might never see your kids again and will wind up in a cage, right? Like that was actually the news of that horror was propagating back into the system and slowing.
None of this has to be like that, though.
Yeah, well,
right?
I
You
would
could
agree.
have a physical border, and then anyone who gets to that border just gets redirected to a legal port of entry where
Yeah.
they have to make an application for asylum, just like everybody else, right? It's an ideology problem. If there was the willing, and look, and the reason we know this is there are examples where it's been fixed in recent years. In 2013, Australia had illegal immigration running at 17,000 people, which for their population of about 25 million people is a lot of people.
But they have these islands. I mean, they have geographical advantages that
what they had was a leader who was willing to do some unpleasant things in order to get that problem fixed. And in the short term and in the interim, there were people who suffered as a result of that. In the long term, there are far fewer people who end up making the perilous journey across the ocean, dying, etc. This is the runaway compassion thing. Look, the idea that a country can have a border is uncontroversial. It's been the case throughout history. How many marine bases are getting invaded in this country? None, because they have a border that's enforced, that's protected.
Right. But I mean, there's a larger geopolitical issue here, which I think our compassion should spread to, which is we should recognize that we have an interest in not merely exporting chaos beyond our borders.
Sure.
We want a world order that is more and more sustainable, more and more equitable. And so we have an interest, if even just a purely selfish interest, to make life better in a place like Honduras, so that we don't have so many Hondurans escaping the murder capital of the world or seeking to escape it, to come to America, right? So that's
100%.
so.
All right, I have more to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have more to say on this. So, Sam, if I can keep you for a few minutes, that would
Okay.
be
Gents,
wonderful.
I'm so sorry I got to run. I've really enjoyed this, and it's been a real pleasure
Good
to see you
you.
both. Yeah, thanks,
Absolutely.
guys.
Always wonderful, my man. All right, everybody, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace.
To learn more about these complex topics, check out this episode with the one and only Jordan Peterson.
Look how much I love my son. He doesn't even have a penis anymore. Those women online displaying themselves, they're not human. You're a fool if you think that's human. And Jews, they have IQs that are probably 15 points higher.